Stop acting like this is still your home. My son said those words without even looking at me, and in that moment, something inside me went completely still. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and looked at the family I thought I knew. 10 days earlier, I had buried my husband of 43 years. 10 days earlier, I had stood beneath a gray Ohio sky and watched the casket disappear into the ground while trying to imagine how I was supposed to live the rest of my life without Robert. I thought that would be the hardest moment of my life. I was wrong. The hardest moment came when my own son decided I no longer belonged in the home his father and I had built together. The dining room felt colder than usual that evening. The oak table Robert had refinished himself 20 years ago stretched between us like a river neither side could cross. The roast chicken sat untouched on my plate. The green beans had gone cold. Across from me, Jessica carefully sipped her iced tea as though nothing unusual had happened. Her expression was calm. Too calm. Michael stared at the table. Not at me. Not at his wife. Just at the table. As if the grain of the wood was more interesting than the woman who had given birth to him. "Mom," he finally said, clearing his throat. "You need to understand we're only thinking about what's best." What's best? Funny how those words always seem to appear right before someone takes something away from you. I nodded slowly. "I see." Jessica leaned forward. "This house is a lot for one person, Helen." Her voice carried the careful sweetness people use when they believe they are being generous. "The stairs. The maintenance. The property taxes. It's probably time to consider something smaller." I looked around the room. The room where Robert and I had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, and Christmas mornings. The room where Michael had blown out candles on every birthday cake from age 5 until he left for college. The room where Robert proposed we finally repaint the walls after 27 years because he said he was tired of looking at the same shade of beige. Smaller. That was the word she chose for 43 years of memories. I pushed my chair back and stood. Neither of them tried to stop me. Neither of them apologized. I walked upstairs slowly, one hand resting on the banister Robert had installed himself. The house creaked softly beneath my feet. Familiar sounds. Loyal sounds. Sounds that had comforted me for decades. When I reached our bedroom, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. Robert's side remained untouched. His reading glasses still sat on the nightstand beside the novel he never finished. His navy cardigan still hung behind the door. For a moment I simply stared at those small pieces of him. Then I opened the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out the photograph we had taken during our 40th anniversary trip to Maine. Robert stood beside me on a rocky shoreline overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Wind pushed his silver hair in every direction. He was smiling. Not the polite smile he gave strangers. The real one. The smile that always made me feel safe. "You should be here," I whispered. The room offered no answer. After a while I heard Michael and Jessica moving around downstairs. Cabinets opening. Dishes clattering. Their voices drifted upward through the floorboards. Low. Casual. Almost cheerful. The conversation sounded strangely normal for two people who had just told a widow she no longer belonged in her own home. I sat there until darkness settled outside the windows. Then I stood, walked to the closet, and pulled out a small overnight suitcase. If anyone had been watching, they might have assumed I was packing to leave. Maybe that was exactly what Michael and Jessica expected. But I wasn't leaving. Not yet. I placed a few documents inside the suitcase. Tax records. Property papers. Old financial statements. Items Robert always insisted should stay organized. Then I added one leather folder I had never paid much attention to before. It had been sitting untouched on the highest shelf for years. Robert had labeled it with a single word written in black marker. Important. I looked at that folder for several seconds before closing the suitcase. Downstairs, the house grew quiet. The dishes had been washed. The lights were turning off one by one. My son probably believed the conversation was over. Jessica probably believed the future was already decided. They thought grief had made me weak. They thought loneliness had made me helpless. They thought I would quietly step aside and surrender everything Robert and I had spent a lifetime building. The next morning, before sunrise, I carried that suitcase to my car and drove to the bank. I didn't tell Michael where I was going. I didn't leave a note. And as the first light of dawn spread across the empty roads of our little Ohio town, I found myself thinking about something Robert once told me years ago. If people ever show you who they really are, he said, believe them the first time. For the first time in my life, I was finally ready to follow that advice. The bank opened at 9 o'clock that morning, but I arrived nearly 40 minutes early. The parking lot was almost empty except for a pickup truck parked near the entrance and a silver sedan covered with a thin layer of dust. I sat behind the wheel of my car and watched the sunrise paint the windows of the building in soft shades of gold. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt something other than grief. I felt curiosity. During our marriage, Robert handled most of the financial paperwork. Not because he believed I could not do it, but because numbers genuinely interested him. He enjoyed organizing records, balancing accounts, and planning for the future. Whenever I asked if I needed to learn more about our finances, he would smile and tell me not to worry. Everything is where it should be, Helen. That was always his answer. Everything is where it should be. As I sat there waiting for the doors to open, I wondered if those words meant more than I had realized. When the bank manager unlocked the entrance, I stepped inside carrying the small suitcase. The lobby smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. A young teller greeted me with a polite smile. I returned it and asked if there was a private office available. 20 minutes later, I found myself sitting across from a woman named Karen who had worked at the branch for more than 15 years. She recognized my last name immediately. Robert had apparently visited often. Mr. Carter was always very organized, she said warmly. He liked having everything documented. I looked down at the leather folder resting on my lap. That sounds like him. Together we began reviewing the documents. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Tax statements, insurance paperwork, property records, old account summaries. The same kinds of papers every family accumulates over decades. Then Karen paused. Her expression changed slightly. Not alarm, not surprise, more like recognition. She pointed to a document near the bottom of the folder. Have you reviewed this before? She asked. I shook my head. The paper looked familiar, yet I could not remember ever reading it. Karen adjusted her glasses and studied the first page. This appears to be connected to a trust. The word immediately caught my attention. Trust. The same word the attorney had mentioned during his phone call. My heart began to beat a little faster. Karen continued reading quietly for several moments before looking back at me. Mrs. Carter, I think you should speak with the attorney listed here. He would be able to explain everything much better than I can. She slid the document across the desk. At the bottom of the page was a name. David Morrison. The same attorney who had called me the previous day. Suddenly the pieces began fitting together. Robert had not left random papers in that folder. He had left a trail. I thanked Karen and carefully returned every document to the suitcase. Before leaving, I sat in my car for several minutes staring at the attorney's phone number. Outside, traffic had started to build. Parents drove children to school. Delivery trucks moved through town. Life continued as if nothing had changed. Yet everything had changed. 10 days earlier, I believed my future would be defined entirely by loss. Now I was beginning to suspect there were parts of Robert's plans I had never fully understood. I finally gathered enough courage to make the call. David Morrison answered on the second ring. His voice sounded calm and professional. Mrs. Carter, he said, almost as if he had been expecting me. I was hoping you would contact me. We arranged to meet later that afternoon at his office downtown. After ending the call, I drove home slowly. The familiar streets looked different somehow. The church where Robert and I attended Sunday services. The diner where we ate breakfast every anniversary. The hardware store where he spent countless Saturday mornings. Every landmark carried memories. Yet alongside those memories was a growing realization that my husband had seen something coming long before I did. When I pulled into the driveway, Michael's car was already there. Jessica's SUV sat beside it. Through the front window, I could see them moving around the living room. They appeared comfortable, relaxed, as though the future belonged entirely to them. I remained in the car for a moment and watched. Not with anger, not with resentment, just observation. Robert used to say that people reveal themselves most clearly when they think no one is paying attention. Michael laughed at something Jessica said. She smiled and pointed toward the staircase leading to the second floor, toward my bedroom, toward the room I had shared with Robert for more than 4 decades. A strange feeling settled over me then. The grief was still there. The loneliness was still there. But beneath both emotions, something stronger had begun to emerge. For the first time since Robert's death, I stopped thinking about what I had lost and started thinking about what he might have left behind. David Morrison's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building overlooking the town square. Robert and I had walked past that building hundreds of times over the years, yet I had never once stepped inside. The waiting room was quiet when I arrived. A grandfather clock ticked softly against one wall. Framed certificates covered another. Everything felt orderly, deliberate, and strangely familiar. Robert had always trusted places that valued order. A receptionist greeted me warmly and led me into a conference room. A few minutes later, David Morrison entered carrying a thick folder. He looked to be in his early 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that seemed older than the rest of him. He shook my hand and sat across from me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he sighed softly. "Helen, before we discuss anything else, I want to tell you how sorry I am about Robert." Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud nearly unraveled me. It had only been 10 days, yet it felt as though an entire lifetime had passed since I last heard his voice. I nodded and thanked him. David opened the folder. "Robert came to see me several times during the last 3 years." I frowned slightly. Robert had never mentioned that. David seemed to notice my surprise. He preferred not to worry you with legal details. That sounded exactly like Robert. He had always believed his job was to shield the people he loved from unnecessary stress. David slid a document across the table. "Do you recognize this?" I looked down. My name appeared on the first page. So did Robert's. Beneath them sat several paragraphs of legal language I did not immediately understand. David pointed to a section halfway down the page. "This is a family trust Robert established years ago." My eyes moved across the words. Trust, trustee, beneficiary, protected assets. The terms felt foreign, yet their importance was impossible to miss. David leaned back in his chair. Robert was concerned about what might happen after his death. The sentence landed heavily between us. "Concerned about what?" I asked quietly. David hesitated before answering. He worried that people might pressure you into making decisions that were not in your best interest. My stomach tightened. Images from the previous week flashed through my mind. Jessica discussing downsizing. Michael avoiding eye contact. Their certainty that I would eventually leave the house. David continued. Robert loved his family deeply, but he was also realistic. He believed preparation was an act of love. I stared at the documents. Suddenly I remembered several conversations from years earlier. Robert occasionally asking unusual questions. What would I do if I ever lived alone? Would I stay in the house? Would I ever consider selling? At the time I thought he was simply planning for retirement. Now those conversations felt different. Deliberate. Purposeful. David opened another folder and removed additional paperwork. "There is something else you should know." He handed me a copy of a property document. My hands trembled slightly as I read it. The house was listed as part of the trust. Not Michael's. Not Jessica's. The trust's. David watched my expression carefully. "As long as you are alive, you have the legal right to remain in that home." I looked up slowly. "No one can force me to leave?" He shook his head. "No one." The room fell silent. Outside the conference room window, a church bell chimed 3 times. For the first time since Robert's funeral, I felt the weight pressing against my chest begin to ease. Not disappear. Never disappear. But ease. David reached into the folder one final time and removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. Across the front, Written in Robert's familiar handwriting were 3 simple words. For Helen only. My breath caught. He left that with me 2 years ago, David said quietly. He instructed me to give it to you personally if certain circumstances arose. I stared at the envelope. Robert's handwriting looked exactly as I remembered. Strong. Steady. Unmistakable. The sight of it hurt more than I expected. It also comforted me. Somehow both emotions existed at once. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten letter. Before reading it, I closed my eyes for a moment. I could almost hear Robert's voice. Almost smell his aftershave. Almost feel his hand resting gently over mine. Whatever was written on those pages had been waiting for me long before his death. Long before Michael's cold distance. Long before Jessica started talking about selling memories as though they were excess furniture. Robert had known something I did not. And as I unfolded the letter and looked down at the first line, I realized I was finally about to discover what it was. My dearest Helen, if you are reading this letter, then I am no longer sitting beside you, and for that I am deeply sorry. I know you well enough to predict what you are doing right now. You are probably trying to stay strong for everyone else. You are probably pretending you are handling things better than you actually are. That was always your way. You carried burdens quietly so the people you loved could walk a little lighter. It was one of the reasons I loved you from the very beginning. I paused after reading those first lines. Tears blurred the page. Not because the words were dramatic. Robert was never a dramatic man. The pain came from how familiar his voice felt. Every sentence sounded exactly like him. Every word carried the calm certainty that had steadied me through 43 years of marriage. I continued reading. There may come a time when someone asks you to doubt your place in this family. If that day arrives, I need you to remember something. You were the foundation of everything we built. Not me. Not our money. Not this house. You. I lowered the paper and stared out the conference room window. The town square below looked unchanged. People crossed sidewalks carrying shopping bags. Cars stopped at traffic lights. Somewhere nearby a lawnmower hummed in the distance. The ordinary world continued moving while my entire understanding of the past quietly shifted. Robert had written this 2 years earlier. 2 years. Long before his final illness. Long before the funeral. Long before the uncomfortable conversations that had followed his death. My eyes returned to the letter. There are things I never told you because I hoped I would never need to. Over the last several years, I noticed changes in people. Small changes. The kind most families ignore because acknowledging them would be painful. I noticed entitlement where gratitude used to be. Expectations where appreciation used to be. Assumptions about the future that concerned me. My stomach tightened as I read those words. Memories began surfacing immediately. Jessica making comments about how large the property was. Michael casually discussing renovation ideas despite never owning the home. Conversations that had seemed harmless at the time now felt different. Not alarming. Just revealing. Robert continued. I do not believe people become selfish overnight. I think it happens slowly. One excuse at a time. One rationalization at a time. One compromise at a time. By the time the change becomes obvious, it has usually been happening for years. David Morrison remained silent while I read. He understood that the room belonged to Robert's voice now. I turned to the next page. If anyone ever pressures you to leave the house, sell the property, surrender your independence, or question your rights, do not make decisions out of grief. Grief clouds judgment. Wait. Listen. Observe. The truth always reveals itself to those willing to be patient. I thought about the previous evening. Michael refusing to meet my eyes. Jessica discussing my future as though I were absent from the room. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether I had misunderstood them. Robert clearly had not. The final page contained only a few paragraphs. Yet those paragraphs affected me more than everything that came before. Helen, if circumstances have brought you to this letter, then I suspect you have already discovered that I created safeguards to protect you. Please do not view them as weapons. They were never intended to punish anyone. They exist because love requires preparation. Real love plans for difficult days. Real love protects people when it no longer has a voice. My vision blurred again. I carefully set the letter on the table. For several moments, neither David nor I spoke. Finally, he cleared his throat. Robert reviewed those documents many times. I nodded slowly. He knew. David folded his hands together. I believe he suspected possibilities. Whether he knew exactly what would happen, I cannot say. That answer felt honest. Robert had never claimed to predict the future. He simply prepared for it. There was a difference. As I gathered the pages, one final handwritten note caught my attention at the bottom of the last sheet. It had been added separately, almost as an afterthought. Trust yourself. More than you think. I stared at those 3 words for a long time. Trust yourself. It sounded simple. Yet I realized how little I had done that recently. Since Robert's death, I had doubted every feeling, every concern, every suspicion. I kept telling myself grief was making me imagine things. Maybe it was not. Maybe my instincts had been trying to warn me all along. When I finally left David's office, the late afternoon sun hung low over the town square. I carried the letter carefully inside my purse. The paper itself weighed almost nothing. Yet somehow it felt heavier than the suitcase I had carried into the bank that morning. During the drive home, memories followed me mile after mile. Jessica asking unusual questions about property taxes. Michael becoming strangely interested in financial matters he once ignored. The way they exchanged glances during conversations. The way certain topics ended whenever I entered a room. By the time I turned into the driveway, I was no longer focused on what Robert had left behind. I was focused on something else entirely. For the first time, I was beginning to see what had been happening right in front of me. The house was unusually quiet when I walked through the front door. Not peaceful quiet. Careful quiet. The kind of silence that settles over a room when people have been talking and suddenly stop. I set my purse on the entry table and hung my coat in the closet. From somewhere upstairs, I heard footsteps. A door closed. Then nothing. I stood there for a moment listening. During 43 years of marriage, Robert and I had filled this house with ordinary sounds. Music playing softly in the kitchen. A television in the family room. Conversations drifting down hallways. Laughter during holidays. Even silence had felt different back then. It had felt comfortable. Now every room seemed to be holding its breath. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. The letter remained safely tucked inside my purse. I had no intention of showing it to anyone. Not yet. Robert's words were still settling into place inside my mind. Trust yourself. The phrase repeated itself over and over. Around 5 o'clock, Jessica came downstairs carrying a stack of magazines. She smiled when she saw me. The smile looked practiced. You were gone most of the day, she said. I was beginning to worry. I almost laughed at the irony. For 10 days she had shown little interest in my feelings, yet suddenly she was worried. Instead, I simply nodded. I had some errands. She placed the magazines on the counter. Well, Michael and I have been talking. There it was again. Those words. Michael and I have been talking. Never we would like your opinion. Never what do you think. Always decisions already forming somewhere beyond my reach. About what? I asked. Jessica hesitated. Just long enough for me to notice. The future. I took a sip of water and waited. She continued. This house is valuable, Helen. You have to think practically. Practical. Another favorite word. It seemed everyone became practical when discussing someone else's life. Before I could answer, Michael entered the kitchen. His expression immediately changed when he realized what Jessica had been discussing. Maybe this is not the best time, he said quietly. Jessica looked annoyed. When is the best time, she asked. Neither of them seemed aware that I was standing 3 feet away. They spoke as though I were a problem to solve rather than a person listening to every word. Michael rubbed the back of his neck. A habit he had carried since childhood whenever he felt uncomfortable. Mom has enough on her mind. Jessica folded her arms. That does not change reality. The conversation ended there, but the damage was already done. Later that evening, after dinner, I carried a basket of laundry upstairs. As I passed the guest room, I noticed the door was partially open. Inside, several cardboard boxes sat against one wall. At first, I thought nothing of it. Then I recognized the labels. Family room, storage closet, dining room. I stepped inside. The boxes contained decorations, picture frames, small keepsakes, items that had been displayed throughout the house for years. My pulse quickened. I carefully lifted one frame from the top box. It held a photograph of Robert holding Michael on his shoulders at a county fair nearly 30 years earlier. That photograph had always sat on the bookshelf in the family room. Why was it packed away? I returned the frame and looked around. More boxes. More labels. Some were still empty. Waiting. Preparing. The realization arrived slowly. Nobody had announced a plan. Nobody had openly admitted anything. Yet evidence was accumulating piece by piece. The photographs disappearing. The conversations stopping when I entered a room. The constant discussions about the future. The boxes. The assumptions. It all pointed in the same direction. Someone was preparing this house for a different life. A life that did not include me. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom reading Robert's letter again. This time, one particular sentence stood out. Observe. The truth always reveals itself to those willing to be patient. Until then, I had viewed patience as passive. Something people practiced while waiting for life to happen. Robert clearly meant something else. He meant watching, listening, learning. So I stopped focusing on what people said and started paying attention to what they did. The next morning provided my first opportunity. Around 10 o'clock, a dark blue sedan pulled into the driveway. A man wearing a sport coat stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. Jessica greeted him at the front door with surprising enthusiasm. Through the living room window, I watched them shake hands. Then she led him inside. Minutes later, they began walking from room to room together. The kitchen, the dining room, the family room. Occasionally, the man made notes on a clipboard. Jessica pointed at walls, windows, and floors while speaking animatedly. I remained upstairs where neither of them realized I could see. My stomach tightened, but I did not interrupt. I did not confront anyone. I simply observed. Because for the first time, I understood something important. Robert had prepared for this moment long before it arrived. And now, quietly and patiently, I was beginning to understand why. The man stayed for nearly an hour. From my bedroom window, I watched him walk through the backyard with Jessica close beside him. They stopped near Robert's garden. She pointed toward the fence line, then toward the patio we had built 15 years earlier. The man wrote something on his clipboard and nodded. By the time he finally left, I no longer doubted what I was seeing. Nobody hires a stranger to inspect every room of a house simply out of curiosity. Later that afternoon, Jessica seemed unusually cheerful. She hummed softly while unloading groceries. Michael appeared distracted, but not surprised. That detail stayed with me. If the visitor had been unexpected, Michael would have asked questions. Instead, he behaved as though everything was proceeding according to plan. I continued doing exactly what Robert had advised. I observed. The following morning, another small piece of the puzzle revealed itself. I was walking past the home office when I heard Jessica speaking on the phone. The door was mostly closed, but her voice carried through the narrow opening. "No, we are hoping to move quickly," she said. A pause followed. "The timing depends on a few details, but we are optimistic." I stopped. Not close enough to be noticed. Just close enough to listen. Another pause. Then Jessica laughed softly. "Trust me. The house will be available. The house will be available." The sentence echoed inside my mind long after the call ended. Available for whom? Available when? Most importantly, who had given her reason to believe such a thing? I continued down the hallway before she could discover me standing there. That evening I called David Morrison. He answered immediately. "Helen, how are you holding up?" I looked around my bedroom before responding. Robert's cardigan still hung behind the door. His reading glasses still rested on the nightstand. Everything felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. "I think they are planning something," I said quietly. David remained silent for a moment. "Tell me everything." So I did. The visitor. The boxes. The conversations. The phone call. David listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. I suspected there might be pressure, he said. Robert worried about that possibility. Did he ever explain why? I asked. Not directly, David replied. But he believed financial expectations can change people, especially when they begin counting assets before they actually belong to them. The truth of those words settled heavily over me. For years, I had viewed Jessica's comments as harmless enthusiasm. She liked home renovation shows. She enjoyed decorating. She often talked about future possibilities. Looking back now, I realized those conversations almost always involved property, money, or inheritance. David spoke again. Remember what I told you. The trust protects you. Legally, your position is secure. Secure. It was a comforting word. Yet legal protection and emotional protection were very different things. The documents could safeguard my rights. They could not erase the sadness of watching my own son drift further away. A few days passed. I said very little. In return, people revealed far more than they realized. One afternoon, while dusting shelves in the family room, I noticed a folder partially hidden beneath a stack of magazines. It probably would have escaped my attention on any other day, but I had become attentive to details. I picked it up. Across the front, someone had written a local real estate company's name. My pulse quickened. I opened the folder. Inside were property evaluation forms, comparable sales reports, estimated market values, notes about renovation potential. The address listed at the top of every page was mine. I carefully returned everything exactly as I found it. Then I sat alone in Robert's favorite armchair for a very long time. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the lawn. The same lawn Michael used to mow during summer vacations when he was a teenager. The same lawn where Robert taught him how to throw a baseball. Families are strange, I thought. Sometimes betrayal does not arrive with shouting or cruelty. Sometimes it arrives disguised as planning, disguised as practicality, disguised as concern. That evening, Michael knocked softly on my bedroom door. "Can we talk?" he asked. I looked up from the book resting in my lap. For a brief moment, he looked like the boy I used to know. Nervous, uncertain, human. "Of course," I said. He stepped inside and sat on the edge of the chair near the window. For several seconds, he struggled to find the right words. Then he finally spoke. "Mom, have you thought any more about your future?" The question sounded innocent. But after everything I had learned, I understood exactly what he was really asking. And for the first time, instead of feeling hurt, I felt prepared. For a moment, I simply looked at my son. The question sounded harmless enough. Any stranger listening from outside the room might have believed he was expressing concern. But I had spent the last several days watching, listening, and learning. I understood the difference between concern and expectation. I replied calmly. Michael nodded as though relieved. "That is good." He glanced toward the window before continuing. "Jessica and I just think it might be easier if you considered other options." Other options. Another carefully chosen phrase. Nobody ever said leave. Nobody ever said move out. Nobody ever said give up the home you built with your husband. They wrapped those ideas inside softer words and hoped I would not notice. "What kind of options?" I asked. Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "There are some really nice communities nearby. Places with activities and people your age." People your age. I almost smiled. Robert would have rolled his eyes at that one. My husband used to joke that growing older did not automatically make everyone friends. "I appreciate the suggestion," I said. "Have you and Jessica already looked at these places?" His hesitation gave me the answer before he spoke. A few. Not one. Not two. Several. Enough to compare. Enough to discuss. Enough to plan. We spoke for another 10 minutes, but the conversation changed nothing. By the time Michael left the room, I knew two things. First, he genuinely believed he was helping. Second, someone had spent a long time convincing him that what benefited him also benefited me. The next morning, I made a decision. I would stop reacting and start acting. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Deliberately. I called David Morrison and arranged another meeting. This time, I brought every document I had found in the house. The real estate reports, the evaluation forms, the notes hidden inside the folder. David reviewed them carefully. His expression remained professional, but I noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. "This is more extensive than I expected," he admitted. "Do these documents change anything?" I asked. He shook his head. "Legally? No. But they reveal intentions." Intentions. The word mattered because intentions often become actions when people believe nobody will stop them. David closed the folder and folded his hands together. "Helen, there is something important you should understand." I waited. "The trust contains provisions Robert specifically requested. If anyone attempts to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence your housing decisions, there are consequences." I stared at him. "What kind of consequences?" David opened another file and turned it toward me. Several pages were marked with colored tabs. "The inheritance structure changes significantly under certain circumstances." For several moments I could not speak. Robert had not simply protected the house. He had protected me. Every scenario he feared had already been considered. Every safeguard had already been written. Suddenly I understood why he had seemed so calm during those final years. He had done everything possible to ensure I would never face this battle alone. When I returned home that afternoon, Jessica was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled. "You seem busy lately." I set my purse on the counter. "I have had a few things to take care of." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Just enough for me to notice." "Anything exciting?" I smiled politely. "Mostly paperwork." The conversation ended there, but something had changed. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her expression. Perhaps she sensed that events were no longer moving exactly as she expected. Over the next week, I played the role they had already assigned me. I remained quiet. I asked few questions. I made no accusations. If anything, I appeared more withdrawn than before. The effect was immediate. Michael relaxed. Jessica became increasingly confident. The boxes in the guest room multiplied. Discussions about renovations became more frequent. One evening, I even overheard Jessica talking about paint colors. Paint colors. For a house that was supposedly not theirs. The strange part was that I no longer felt angry. A month earlier, these discoveries would have devastated me. Now they simply informed me. Robert's letter had changed something fundamental. I stopped viewing myself as a victim waiting for bad news. Instead, I became an observer gathering facts. One Saturday afternoon, while Jessica was out shopping and Michael was visiting a friend, I walked through every room of the house. The family room, the kitchen, the hallway lined with photographs, the backyard where Robert spent countless evenings tending flowers. I moved slowly, touching familiar surfaces along the way. A bookshelf, a picture frame, the banister Robert installed with his own hands. At the end of my walk, I stopped in front of our wedding photograph hanging near the staircase. Two young people smiled back at me from another era. We had been so certain life would be simple. We had been wrong about that. Life was never simple. But standing there, I realized something important. This story was no longer about a house. It was about promises. Robert had made one. And soon, whether they were ready or not, everyone else was going to learn exactly how seriously he had taken it. 3 days later, I invited Michael and Jessica to dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just a quiet family meal on a Thursday evening. When I mentioned it over breakfast, Jessica looked pleasantly surprised. Michael seemed relieved. I suspect they both interpreted the invitation the same way. They believed I had finally accepted the future they were preparing for me. Throughout the day, the house felt strangely lighter. Jessica moved through the kitchen humming softly while organizing cabinets. Michael spent most of the afternoon outside, cleaning the garage. More than once I caught them exchanging satisfied looks. It was the expression people wear when they think a difficult problem is about to solve itself. By 6 o'clock, the dining room table was set. The same oak table where Robert and I had shared thousands of meals. The same table where difficult conversations had unfolded for decades. Some joyful, some painful. Tonight would be different. Tonight would bring clarity. Jessica complimented the meal several times. Michael seemed unusually relaxed. We talked about ordinary things at first. The weather, local news, a new restaurant opening downtown. Nobody mentioned moving. Nobody mentioned real estate. Nobody mentioned the future. That silence alone told me everything I needed to know. They were waiting. Waiting for me to bring it up. Waiting for me to surrender. Halfway through dinner, I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. The small movement immediately captured their attention. "There is something I would like to discuss," I said calmly. Jessica straightened in her chair. Michael lowered his fork. Neither spoke. "Over the past few weeks, I have spent a great deal of time thinking about the future." Jessica smiled politely. "That is understandable." I nodded. "I agree." Then I reached beside my chair and lifted a leather folder onto the table. The room grew noticeably quieter. Michael glanced at the folder. Jessica's smile faded slightly. "What is that?" she asked. Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Nobody moved. The bell rang again. I stood. "Excuse me." When I returned a moment later, David Morrison walked in behind me. The expression on Michael's face shifted immediately. Surprise. Confusion. Concern. Jessica looked even more unsettled. David greeted everyone politely and took the empty chair beside me. For several seconds, nobody said a word. Finally, Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, what is going on?" I looked at him carefully. Not with anger. Not with disappointment. Simply honesty. "I think it is time we all understand the same facts." David opened the folder. Several documents rested neatly inside. He placed them on the table one at a time. Property records. Trust documents. Legal summaries. Papers Robert had prepared years earlier. Jessica stared at them without touching anything. Michael looked overwhelmed. David spoke calmly. "Robert Carter established a family trust several years before his passing." Michael blinked. "A trust?" David nodded. "The trust governs ownership of the home and other assets." The room remained silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. David continued. "Under the terms of the trust, Helen has the absolute right to remain in this residence for the rest of her life." Michael looked at me, then at the documents, then back at me. "I did not know that," he said quietly. I believed him. Jessica said nothing. David turned another page. "There are additional provisions." His voice remained steady, professional, unemotional. "Any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or improperly influence Helen regarding her housing arrangements triggers significant changes to inheritance distributions." Jessica's face lost color. Not dramatically. Just enough for years of confidence to suddenly look uncertain. Michael leaned forward. "What does that mean?" David met his eyes. "It means Robert anticipated certain possibilities and created safeguards." Nobody spoke for a long time after that. The silence felt different from the silences we had shared in recent weeks. This one contained truth. Eventually, Michael looked down at the table. "Dad did all this?" David nodded. "Yes." Michael swallowed hard. "Why?" For the first time all evening, I answered before David could speak. "Because he loved me." The words settled over the room. Simple. Undeniable. True. Nobody argued. Nobody challenged them. Across the table, Jessica stared at the documents as though seeing them for the first time. Michael sat motionless. And in that moment, I realized something important. Robert had not built those protections because he expected conflict. He built them because he understood human nature. He understood that grief creates vulnerability. He understood that assumptions grow dangerous when left unchallenged. Most importantly, he understood that love sometimes requires a voice that continues speaking even after a person is gone. And tonight, through every page resting on that table, Robert's voice had finally been heard. The days that followed felt different. Not because the house had changed, but because the truth no longer lived in the shadows. For the first time since Robert's funeral, nobody spoke about my future as though I were absent from the room. Nobody mentioned downsizing. Nobody discussed retirement communities. The silence that replaced those conversations was uncomfortable, but it was honest. Michael spent more time by himself. Some evenings I would find him sitting on the back patio staring across the yard toward the garden his father loved so much. He seemed lost. Not angry. Not defensive. Just lost. One afternoon he knocked on my bedroom door. The same way he had done when he was a teenager and needed advice he was afraid to ask for. "Mom, do you have a minute?" he said quietly. I set aside the book I had been reading and nodded. He stepped inside and sat across from me. For several moments he struggled to find the right words. Finally, he looked down at his hands. "I owe you an apology." The sentence hung between us. Simple. Uncomfortable. Necessary. I said nothing. Sometimes silence creates space for honesty. Michael took a deep breath. I convinced myself I was helping. I told myself I was being practical. But the truth is, I stopped listening to you. His voice cracked slightly. And I stopped respecting what this house means. I studied his face. For the first time in weeks, I saw my son again. Not a man caught up in plans and expectations. Just my son. The little boy who used to run through these hallways wearing superhero pajamas. The teenager who sat at this very desk doing homework while Robert grilled hamburgers outside. The young man who cried when his father taught him how to drive. People do not become strangers overnight. Sometimes they simply lose their way. "Your father loved you very much," I said softly. Michael closed his eyes for a moment. "I know." A few days later, Jessica approached me while I was watering flowers in the backyard. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and damp soil. She stood quietly beside me for several seconds before speaking. I was wrong. The words seemed difficult for her. I respected that. Admitting mistakes rarely comes easily. She looked toward the house. I became focused on what I thought our future should look like. Somewhere along the way, I stopped considering how you felt. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." She looked surprised that I did not argue or criticize her. But there was no point. Carrying resentment would not honor Robert. Learning from the experience would. Winter arrived gradually. The garden went dormant. Holiday lights appeared throughout the neighborhood. Life continued. One Saturday morning, I found Michael standing in the garage sorting through old boxes. Robert's tools sat neatly organized nearby. "What are you doing?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Dad always wanted me to learn how to maintain this place properly." He held up an old toolbox. "I figured it is about time." Together we spent the afternoon cleaning shelves and organizing equipment. The work itself was not important. The conversation was. For the first time in months, we talked openly. About Robert. About mistakes. About grief. About family. By evening, the garage looked better than it had in years. More importantly, so did our relationship. The following spring, I sat alone on the front porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of orange and gold beyond the maple trees. Birds settled into branches. Somewhere down the street, children laughed while riding bicycles. The world felt peaceful again. Not perfect. Life never becomes perfect. But peaceful. I thought about everything that had happened since Robert's death. The fear. The confusion. The disappointment. The discoveries. Most of all, I thought about the letter. Trust yourself. More than you think. Robert had been right. Not because he predicted every detail. Not because he created legal protections. He was right because he understood something essential. Strength is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not arrive through revenge. Real strength is the ability to remain steady when everything around you feels uncertain. I looked back at the house. Our house. The home Robert and I built one careful year at a time. The place where our family began. The place where difficult lessons had finally been learned. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. I smiled and rested my hand on the porch railing Robert installed many years ago. For the first time since losing him, I did not feel alone. I felt grateful. And as the last light disappeared beyond the horizon, I realized that some promises are strong enough to outlive the people who make them.